Welcome to Bake to the Future. The wholesale baking industry mixes tradition and innovation to feed the world and the economy, generating some major dough while employing nearly 800,000 people in the U.S. We bring you a fresh take on the latest trends and issues impacting the baking sector through exclusive insights and conversations. Brought to you by the American Bakers Association, who will take you Bake to the Future.
Hi, welcome everyone. I'm Haley Blumenreich.
And I'm Katie Jewell. And today on the show, we're talking about how the food and beverage industry, among many other sectors, is facing unprecedented supply chain hurdles and inflationary pressures across the board. Today, we have a panel of experts on hand to help us talk through one of the big moving parts, commodities. Recent explosions in input commodity prices are not limited to grains and wheat. Meanwhile, supply shortages loom for critically important ingredients such as oils, sweeteners, and even gluten.
And joining us is Hayden Wands, the VP of Global Procurement at Grupo Bimbo, the largest baking company in the world. Hayden is also ABA's Commodity and Agricultural Professionals Group Chair. Thanks for being here, Hayden.
Thanks for having me. Looking forward to the discussion.
Also lending their expertise is Bill Lapp, founder and president of Advanced Economic Solutions. He spent the last 3 decades analyzing and forecasting economic conditions and commodity markets. We're looking forward to hearing more from you. Thanks for joining us, Bill.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
And leading our conversation is ABA's in-house expert, Lee Sanders, Senior Vice President of Government Relations and Public Affairs, and regulatory color commentary from ABA's Rasmus Voners, VP of Technical and Regulatory Affairs. Thank you both for helping us with this complicated topic.
Thanks, Haley. Thanks, Katie. Glad to be here.
And before we hand over the mic, we have to start off with our tough ball, hardball questions. Bill, first, we'd like to know from you, as someone who spends a lot of time talking about baked good inputs, what is your favorite baked good?
Oh, geez. Just about anything, but I have a real weakness for the honey bun.
Yum. And how about you, Hayden?
Sara Lee, delightful.
And are you just saying that because that pays your salary, or what is it about it? It's so delightful for you.
Well, it's 45 calories a slice. I mean, Where can you get that, right?
How many slices do you have? And honestly, Hayden, I am wondering, a lot of times when we have our members on the show, we ask, how did you get into the baking industry? And I mean, you're in commodities. What is if you wouldn't mind giving us the elevator pitch version of how you got to where you are today?
No, sure. Well, by circumstance, but got a degree at Kansas State University in flour milling and business marketing. Started out trading grain on the floor of the Kansas City Board of Trade. Then went to, I was at Bartlett, and then I was at ADM Flour Milling, buying the wheat for them. And then I went to farmland for a while, trading wheat, and then to Cargill, I was selling flour, and to Sara Lee, I was buying flour, and then I was promoted to head of procurement for Sara Lee. Sara Lee was bought by BBU, and then I moved over to Grupo Bimbo, and that's where I am today.
I want to back up just a little bit because at the very beginning you said I went to K-State for flour milling and business stuff. So, you're an 18-year-old kid going to college and you're like, I want to work in flour milling. What was it that led you to that?
Well, back when I was thinking about going to school, U.S. was in a recession, and a friend of my father's who was a veterinarian said, you ought to go into milling science because you're always guaranteed a job. And I said, good enough for me. And so that's how I got into it. So it was, didn't even know what a flour mill looked like. Had no idea. So.
Are you from Kansas? Is that the connection there?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So at least, you were familiar with wheat and all of that. You're surrounded by the Great Plains of wheat.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, that's fun. I always love hearing how people get into the industry. Everybody has different paths. And before we hand over the mic to people who are much more qualified to handle the line of questioning about commodities, we want to make a note that this recording is happening on June the 2nd, 2021, and things are shifting and changing pretty quickly. So that's why we wanted to make note of the date. So with that, I am going to step away and let Lee handle it.
Thanks, Katie. Thanks, Haley. Well, gosh, I'm really glad that we were all able to get together today. There's been so much impact with the ongoing pandemic. It has impacted the baking industry in so many ways. And now we're dealing with volatility in the commodity markets that's really unsurpassed, where it's impacting commodities, supplies, the transportation delays around all of these things. It's really created the perfect storm. And while we've seen volatility before that's impacted the markets and impacted our industry, this feels a little different from what we've seen in the past. So, I'm really glad that we have Bill and Hayden here today. So, Bill, as a commodities expert, can you give us your high-level insight on inflationary trends relevant to the baking industry?
Sure. So commodities are a big part of it, and that's the one that we're going to focus on today. But there are other inflationary aspects that are hitting the baking industry. Labor is a real challenge right now, and labor rates are going up. Energy costs have increased. Transportation is a critical. There's a lot of supply chain issues that are under great duress right now, and I think it's adding to the challenge of feeding people just in general. And the commodities are usually the primary focus of it, but it's a little more broad based than you would typically find.
Yeah, there seem to be a lot of inflation hotspots right now. That's for certain. When we think about grain and oilseed prices, they're up sharply over the past year, with corn and wheat futures rising to all-time records. What have been the major causes for that?
Well, a couple things in my mind. Last July, we were sitting fat and happy, and prices were weak, and it looked like we were going to have an abundance of production. And the weather changed. We had something called a derecho that went through Iowa that hurt the corn crop. It lost about 1 billion bushels of production last year at the end of the year. That certainly pushed prices higher. But maybe a bigger factor has been China entering the market. And China typically purchases about 400 million bushels a year, about 20 million tons of feed grains. And last year they upped that their imports to over 40 million tons, or around 900 million bushels. So that increased demand from China, that underpinning the markets have really drove prices sharply, and we repeatedly saw them come in and absorb any excess in supplies. Soybean oil is a little bit of a separate issue, but for the grains, it really was the reduction in the crop size as well as China buying.
So pivot a little here. What role have managed money funds played in the price gains?
Well, it's been significant. They are aiding and abetting the volatility, I guess, is one way to put it. They're exaggerating the moves and creating more elevated. I like to think of the funds and their participation. They define the path we take to where prices will eventually be. Supply demand dictates where you're going to end up, but the path you take is dictated by the funds. And we're seeing it here as we enter the key parts of the 2021 growing season. The fund involvement has pushed the market significantly higher and significantly lower, almost certainly on a daily basis, almost on an hourly basis, and creating the need for greater discipline among supply chain professionals.
So when we're thinking about the big picture, how long do you anticipate the prices to remain at this current elevated levels?
I can give you two scenarios, and if I didn't do that as an economist, I'd be violating union rules. So one scenario is that we will have ample supplies, a good corn crop this year specifically, and the wheat crops will finish up well, which is still a question mark. And China isn't a big buyer, and in that scenario, we probably relax prices by late 2021, early 2022. The second scenario, which is becoming more viable right now, is that we have a continued strong purchases by China, and we've already seen them in the market for significant quantities. And if there's any hiccup in yields, which we really won't know until probably with any certainty until Labor Day, then you have a scenario where you could have much higher prices and you could keep corn prices elevated through most of 2022 and into the fall. I don't think this is a long-term shift, but we will have to endure higher prices for some time. The soybean oil situation is a little bit different, and I think that's an area where we could stay at these elevated levels for 2 years or more because of the influx of demand for soybean oil to make renewable diesel.
So maybe we talk a little bit more about the soy oil futures. Gosh, they've doubled over the past year. What are the primary catalysts for that sharp increase? Is there anything beyond the renewable diesel? Is there anything else that's really impacting besides, the demand from maybe global demand?
Right. So, there's it takes a lot of factors to make a situation like that. And one has been the strong demand we've seen globally and tightening stocks for veg oil around the world. And we had a palm oil supply issue in Malaysia, and that reduced supplies last year. The canola crop has been suboptimal in Canada the last couple of years. But the key catalyst, the one that's highly inelastic in demand, has been the new capacity that's come on in to produce renewable diesel. And this, it's revolves around Californication. Everything has to do with California's thirst for a way to reduce greenhouse emissions through the low carbon fuel standard. So there are new plants that are being built. They have tremendous tax incentives to continue to purchase fats and oils. And that has led to a steady increase in the price of veg oils over the past year.
Well, kind of thinking broadly, all the things that you've been talking about, what are the key fundamental factors that the industry should be paying attention to as they're kind of thinking about the future?
Well, certainly the shorter term, the weather, and trying to manage your way around that, and having a understanding of what China has done and what they're capable of doing to the markets. I think disciplined risk management is of critical importance in a situation like this. That you understand your objectives within your company. That you have a real keen eye on watching your margins and making sure you're taking advantage of price swings, because we talked about the funds a second ago and how they cause sharp increases and sharp decreases. Well, in being disciplined, you have to take advantage of those sharp decreases as well. A secondary thing, which typically you wouldn't think of, and at least for the short term, we have to think about supply availability in the veg oil market. availability of refined soybean oil has become much tighter with the advent of renewable diesel, and it's important that there's a good relationship between with your suppliers as you go into that.
Yeah. That sounds like a perfect time for us to pivot and get Hayden Wan's perspective, certainly as our ABA Commodity and Ag Policy Professionals Group chair, and as the Global Procurement Officer for BBU. Hayden, give us the baker's perspective on all of this.
Well, I'll just say, wow, that's our perspective. A lot has changed in the markets. Obviously, since last October, we've seen a significant increase in really all the major commodities. But we've seen that before. So that's we're not in the 2008 commodity market, but we've seen these high prices before, and we will again, as Bill said, that they're going to probably maintain themselves. I think what's new for the baking industry is the supply chain issue. And what I mean by that is that we are taxed now not only with high commodity prices, but actually getting the ingredients to the bakeries. That's been a very burdensome challenge for us, really, from a domestic standpoint, since we've kind of entered this post-COVID economy in the U.S. where things are opening up, people are getting out. There's more demand for trucks, for carriers. There's more demand for ingredients. There's more demand for everything, and we haven't been really faced with that in the past, where the floodgates opened all at once. So really, I would say the supply chain challenges that we have seen this year, or really in the last few months, have been something that we haven't faced as an industry for a while, and we're going to have to deal with that for a while. The philosophy of just-in-time inventory, lowest cost country, all of those have to be challenged in this new environment. Because again, if you have that just-in-time inventory with the supply chain lengthening in time, you're going to possibly have disruptions in your production. And so we've got to really rethink, what we've been ingrained to establish over the last few years, because it has changed, and we don't see that environment changing, going backwards at all. So supply chain is the issue.
Yeah, and we're dealing with bottlenecks at the ports. We're dealing with container issues. We're dealing with getting vessels secured for the containers to get them to the ports. Those are all things that ABA has been addressing with other stakeholders, but that really can impact a number of commodities and all kinds of materials that bakers need.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, it is the entire supply chain, and it can be a disruption of not only commodity based ingredients, but of the non-commodity based ingredients. The packaging, the chemicals, the emulsifiers. I mean, everything has been affected as this supply chain has tightened, and we've seen it globally as well. If you look to Central America, with some of the political disruption down there, they've got protesting in the streets where they've been literally blocking trucks from coming into the bakeries because of the protests. So it's just not a domestic issue. It's a global issue. As we roll out, we eventually are rolling out of this. We're going into this post-COVID global economy.
Wow, you've seen a lot. You've got great expertise. What would your advice to bakers be right now?
Well, I think really when we saw COVID, when COVID took hold, in March and April of last year, and we saw a surge in demand from our customers, I think probably the most important thing I could say is definitely strengthen the relationship with your supply partners. And we do call them partners because that's what they are. Our in the milling community, our millers are our milling partners because it takes a lot of coordination. And so, the best advice that I could give is, make sure who are you dealing with, that you have a relationship with them. It could be a long-term relationship, and again, that's probably the most important thing that's come out of this whole event is the coordination between our supply partners and ourselves when it comes to bringing ingredients into the bakery. Stronger relationships lead to more success.
That's always the case, isn't it?
Always. But especially now, it's really highlighted now. I mean, to where, I think in the past you could be some in our community were a little more transactional, and looking at a 3-month or 6-month contract. I think again, just like we're talking about just-in-time inventory and lowest cost country, all of those strategies that we employed before really have to be looked at in this new environment.
Yeah, it's a whole nother ball of wax we're dealing with now. So, but I think all of this insight's been great, and now it wouldn't be a podcast with me in it unless we had to talk about a little bit of policy. And we've got Rasma here too. She's got great expertise with regard to the RFS program. And so, Rasma, can you share, your thoughts on, the influences that the RFS is having on the current situation?
Sure. Thank you, Lee. Yeah, I think Bill alluded to this as he touched on some of the volatility that we're seeing. And there are two key players here. One being a federal program that's mandated by the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, which is the Renewable Fuel Program, focusing on biodiesel. And at the federal level, EPA needs to ensure annual quotas of renewable fuels, which includes the biodiesel, and that those are sold as transportation fuel in the United States. So basically what happens is each year, EPA will establish a quota for the fuel categories through what's called the Renewable Volume Obligation. It's a rulemaking process. It's usually proposed in late spring, and then a final rule comes out in November. Unfortunately, last calendar year, the agency missed its deadline, so we're anticipating those renewable volume obligations coming forth in the near term. And there's actually been some press reports that have indicated that EPA plans to hold steady, just recognizing some of the challenges that are currently out there. But in the process of making these determinations on what those quotas will be, the EPA does have to coordinate with other agencies, and that includes the Department of Energy and also USDA. And it has to sort of go through a tiered review and analyze several factors. And I think this is an important one that comes into play. The factors include, environmental impact, energy security, infrastructure and deliverability, the cost of transportation fuel and transportation in general. But most importantly, one of the factors that EPA needs to consider is including what is the price and supply of agricultural commodities, rural economic development, and food prices. And so EPA needs to set these quotas at a reasonable, attainable volume, but it also needs to consider some of the other diversions that we're seeing from the feedstocks that are often used in that program. So I think that's one factor. And then Bill also alluded to The state level, we have the California program, which is coming very much online, and that's the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard. And that program mandates a 20% reduction in the carbon intensity of transportation fuels, so diesel, gasoline, that's sold in California, with an overall goal of reaching that decrease in intensity by 2030. So that means that petroleum fuel sellers in California are required to reduce their carbon intensity across all of their product lines as they move towards that deadline. And, fuel supplies must lower their intensity in two ways. So they either need to substitute a biofuel or they have to purchase a credit. And I think, from the California program, you don't sort of have that opportunity to assess what the greater harm may be to the economy that you do under the federal program with the renewable fuels. When California developed its program, the regulators did look at the food versus fuel, quote, debate when designing their program, but they claimed that the low carbon fuel standard would have little effect on food prices because it rewarded non-food biofuels. And that they felt that the federal program had a greater impact. But I think in light of everything that we've seen over the past year with the pandemic, and the supply chain pieces, I think in particular with the changes of who is purchasing different products and the impact from China, that both of these regulatory programs just are another sort of layer that make these things more complicated.
Yeah, and I think, it's an opportunity for ABA to be a voice at the table. I think that, in advance of that announcement on the quotas that we expect, we've been hearing that they may put that out in July. That would be a public comment opportunity. I think that that's certainly an opportunity for ABA, the bakers and other stakeholders. Then maybe there's even an opportunity, to talk about the current situation in advance of that announcement. There's also USDA has a public comment period that's open right now till June 21st to talk about the supply chain security. And so that's another opportunity where ABA is going to be weighing in. Certainly, and there's a lot at stake. They need to understand our perspective, what the impacts are, what our members are seeing, and how it's impacting their businesses. ABA is in constant discussions with other stakeholders that are being impacted. We're looking at analyzing and then talking about educating and outreach to USDA, EPA, Department of Energy, and the White House. We need to figure out who our congressional champions can be on these really critical issues. And it's really important that we have strong messaging for our members to help them as they're communicating with their customers and with the public. And so I think everything's evolving. There's a lot at stake. And ABA is here to serve as a great resource for our members. So our time is short. This has been great. I think we could go on for another hour. But I'd encourage everybody that's listening to please join us, ABA members, for our June 10th ABA Commodity and Agriculture Policy Professionals Group virtual conference. We're going to take a deeper dive, hear more from Bill and Hayden and the ABA Government Relations team, and we hope to see you all at the table. So thanks for joining us today, everybody.
Yeah, and actually, before we wrap up completely, just listening in on that whole conversation, I'm hearing a lot of doom and gloom. And anytime I hear anything about threats of ingredients not making it to the bakery, and I do a lot of work with our press partners, both in the trade press and commercial press, and my antennas go up. And I think if the ingredients aren't getting it to the bakery, how concerned should we be? I guess that's a twofold question. So Hayden, are you concerned?
Well, always. I mean, but it's one of those where you just have to be diligent, right? You have to be vigilant. You have to work with your suppliers. I mean, as long as you have a very open line of communication with your suppliers and give them a lot of lead time, they will work with you. I mean, we have our challenges, but as it stands now, we don't have any I'll say ingredient insecurity. Let's put it that way. You can't call up a supplier and say, I need the load tomorrow, right? Those days are gone. And so it just takes a lot more intensive work managing the supply chain and working with your supplier partners.
And before I ask Bill a similar line of questioning, you did talk about how building the relationships with your partners, your supplier partners, has that been more of a challenge during the COVID era? And how have you overcome that?
I mean, it hasn't been a challenge. I'll say it's intensified. Let's put it that way. We have a lot more communication with our suppliers. Again, we have a lot more. They're asking for a lot more forecasting, and so we're having to do things that we didn't necessarily have to do, 3-4 years ago, just because of the current environment. So I would say our relationships have intensified with our suppliers.
And Bill, going back to all of the commodities issues that we walked through, how concerned are you? Are we at code orange? Are we code red? Kind of, if there was a concern level, where are we?
For overall commodity availability, at current prices, there's plenty available. But the prices have doubled. I mean, that's where the challenge is, and these are costs that ultimately the consumer bears. So I think that weather front, right now, not quite orange. I mean, there's some areas. Spring wheat is in a challenging position right now and needs rain in the northern plains in Canada. Hard wheat is in better shape. So it's kind of mixed. The corn crop's off to a good start. So mixed to maybe good, excluding the northern plains would be in that area. But China's a mystery, and we are learning every day a little more about supply challenges they're having that impact our markets, where they come in and purchase significant quantities of grain. So maybe an orange on that one. It's our hair's not on fire, but it's certainly a greater challenge than it was pre-pandemic.
And Hayden, before we really truly all the way wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, I just, be vigilant, challenge, the status quo on really how you've done things in the past, because I think the way we view it is how we've done it in the past is not how we're going to be able to do it in the future, right? So you really need to rethink the entire model.
Well, I think that with that, we will wrap up and wanted to thank you all for joining us today on the podcast. I've certainly learned a lot, and I wanted to let our listeners know that if you enjoyed this conversation, you would really enjoy our last episode on the supply chain crisis, which was more of an overview of what's going on. And you can let us know what you thought of the show by emailing hello@americanbakers.org or leave us a voicemail at baketothefuture.org. And don't forget to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, whether that's Apple, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Amazon Music, or Ghana.
Bake to the Future is brought to you by the American Bakers Association in partnership with Human Factor. To hear upcoming and past episodes, go to baketothefuture.org. Bake to the Future is produced by Haley Blumenreich. Audio engineer is Blake Alton. And A Slice of the Action is written by the American Bakers Association's Government Relations team.